Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for spending some time with me again today. I'm very, very excited to be chatting with Monique Day-Wilde today. She is a fantastic fiber artist and an author of many, many, many books. And I'm very excited that I can share her story with you today. So, Monique, if you will explain to us how you got into textiles and art and how your journey began.
Well, thanks, Melanie, for having me, first of all. My journey started probably when I was a little kid. I was very blessed to have a very creative grandmother and aunt. My mom wasn't that creative. I think she knitted, but my grandmother had an enormous influence on my life, and she did ceramics, and she also wove. She taught me to weave before I was 10. And she had a few looms at home, so I had my own little table loom that I would mess around on. And she taught me to sew and knit and crochet and all those things that one's grandmother is really there for. So I was very, very blessed. She was also a florist. And my grandfather had his own small nursery next to their home, very small. But I think from that point I was really very interested in plants and how they grew. I'm not really good at it, and I'm terrible at names. But obviously the little seed was sown, because later on when I went to, we didn't do art at school. We never had art at school, which was, we tried to have it as a subject, but the school I went to wasn't particularly interested. So I did textile design when I left school. And in those days, you didn't have to have very much work to show anybody, because done odd scribble in a sketchbook, but not much more than that. Although I had sewn, as you know, I'm very good friends with Angie Weiswanger, and we went through school, we sewed our own clothes, we did all sorts of creative things together. And so when I left school and went and did textile design, it was really something that was quite ingrained in me, I think. And I discovered that there's almost not one generation in my family that hasn't been involved in the last good few 100 years textiles in some way. So I suppose it's in the genes. So I did textile design, and then after that, it didn't work in a textile factory per se, but went into hand weaving, where we spun our own wool and mohair for handmade trees and carpets, and did all the designing as we spun our own yarn, and we hand dyed it. It was all hand dyed. And then I did that for many, many years, and eventually had a small factory with my husband. And then sanctions hit us, and we were almost closed down overnight. And so we lost our little factory, our weavers and spinners lost their jobs, and it was a really bit of a nightmare. So for quite a long while, I was out of textiles completely. And then I was living in Bloemfontein and was asked to lecture because somebody was going on leave. So I lectured there for a while. And then we moved to Johannesburg, where I lectured part-time at the London School of Fashion, which is still going today. I was one of their textile lecturers there. And then we moved to Cape Town, and I started a little studio at home. My children were tiny, and so I didn't want to go and work full time, so I started a studio at home, and I taught in those days fabric painting, because that was all the thing at the time. And it's actually very interesting to me, because a lot of people that started fabric painting then have gone on to become artists in their own rights, and it sort of that sort of helped them, because it's an a piece of fabric, you paint on it, and if you don't like it, well, you turn it into a dishcloth, and that's fine. It's not this is a painting on a canvas and now I have to be the best ever. It's a non-threatening way of starting to paint, and I think a lot of people really like that. Yes, so I was teaching at home and writing notes and giving notes away, and I had a chat to Angie one day, and I said, I'm so tired of doing these workshops and giving notes away. I said, we have to try and harness this energy in a different way, that we can make perhaps a little more income.
Yes.
Because as you know, you don't make that much money teaching. And she was also teaching fabric painting at that point, and so we decided to join forces, and we wrote our first book, which we tried to have published. It didn't work, and we then published our own, or printed our own little book. Neither of us had computers. We weren't computer literate at all, and she couldn't even type in those days. So we wrote it out all by hand, and I went to PE for a week, and she read our script out to me, and I typed, because I did know how to type, probably not that well. And we borrowed a computer, and so that first book went on to a floppy disk, if anybody still knows what that is.
Yes.
And so we cut and pasted, we printed it out, cut and pasted pictures, and then photostated it. I mean, when I think about it now, it's hysterical.
Yes. I love it. It's such an inspiring story.
It was very much your high school project type thing at the time, when I look back now.
Yes.
But we sold this book because it was so full of information, and I in my teaching one of my classes, there was a woman who had a small dye making company, and she had been invited to the launch of a craft magazine, couldn't go, so she said, well, here's my ticket, why don't you go? And somebody else I knew was also going, so the two of us went off together, and this was in Cape Town, and Metz was there, and I happened to be sitting next to somebody at this breakfast who had said, that she had published a book, and there was her publisher, Vilsia. So I thought, okay, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. So I walked up to her. She was standing chatting to somebody, and I waited patiently, and I said, hi, Vilsia. So-and-so's given me your told me who you are, and I've written this manuscript with a good friend of mine, and I'd love to show it to you. I think you need to see it.
Okay.
So he said, oh, actually, funny you should say that, but I am looking for a book on fabric painting. Another fabric painting book had just been published, but we had such a vast array of techniques and I explained this to her. So she came and visited me, and I showed her what I'd done, and I showed her this manuscript, and gave her a copy. And a couple of weeks later, she said, okay, they had made a decision, and they were going to publish it. So after quite a long time, we were eventually published. And when I think back to that first book, we probably overwrote it terribly. I mean, we learned so much. Eventually we did, can't remember now, about 11 together. And we learned so much over time that we were eventually taking our own photographs for some of the step pictures, because it was just, you know, it didn't take up so much time. The production then was quicker and so on. Although Ivan Nordier, bless his soul, he took all the pictures, you know, the main pictures for those books, which he did for your books as well. And just a very special man, and with a very dry sense of humor.
Yes.
And he'd always catch us at least once during a photo shoot. I remember the first photo shoot we did, you know, you mock up the shoot, and I'd done a piece of fabric which looked like a curtain, so we wanted to sort of mock up this curtain shot. And so Angie and I were on either end of a rail, which you obviously couldn't see in the picture, and we were standing up above a kitchen sink because the light was right just there.
Yes. And
he said, no, a little bit higher, a little bit lower. And he had us going for about 10 minutes. Until he said, Michael, can you just take the picture? I think he would have gone on for half an hour. And he used to just at least once like that in every shoot. And very dry.
That sounds like an Ivan thing to do.
Creative. Absolutely. And I think some of the shots from behind the scenes of those books were really funny. I mean, you know, if you were a fly on the wall, quite entertaining. But we learned a lot from him, you know, in terms of photographic angles and lighting. And he was one of a kind, I have to say. Yeah, so after that first book, Angie and I carried on. We did, launched into art books. People had, by that stage, sort of become perhaps a bit tired of fabric painting. And they'd asked about other art techniques. And she and I both are one of those people, if we don't know, we'll go and find out. And we both are, you know, what if you do this, and what will happen if you add that? And so we did the various art books in mixed media. Well, all our books are really mixed media, just in different ways, you know, with focus. The first one, Quick Art, which is now out of print, the focus was really on using anything you could find in your garage, you know, PVA, whatever, board, just to be creative from what's around you. And then Smart Art, the focus there was more on recycling, because we both are squirrels of note, and I forage all the time. I think you can see behind me here, I've got all sorts, I've got feathers and wings of birds, and I'm a real squirrel. And every now and again I'll go for a walk and I'll get back home and I'll find that a neighbor's put some treasure on my doorstep.
Lovely.
You know, a rusty something or another, because I can dye some paper or something with it. So I think my neighbors think I'm quite strange.
Clearly they're entertained though.
Oh yes, talking about rust, I can't show it to you because it's sitting next to me quite wet still. I walk. Part of my process in my art that I make now is walking. I realized at the beginning of lockdown, when I wasn't able to walk, how important that is as part of my process. Because as soon as I could walk again, I felt 1,000% better. Being just stuck at home, not being able to walk. Because a lot of my work is what I forage. I will pick seeds and plants, and even if it's in my garden, wherever. And of course, I'm very lucky to live in the middle of a biosphere in the Overberg, which is a fynbos, very rich fynbos area. So the plants that I see and find are some of them just quite extraordinary. And so I use the plants, either drawings. I go out and walk and then draw outside, or pick plants from, you can't pick in the nature reserve, but you can on the plot. So if I find something, because I use the physical plants to print with, and then I'll use those the prints that I make in either on their own, or I'll use them as part of a collage, which is the beginning of the piece of work. So I'll use a print in a collage. I'll either glue it or stitch it. I use a lot of stitching in my work. So ultimately what I'm making at the moment are paper quilts. So I work mostly with paper, but sort of collaged or quilted together, and with layers and layers, so paint and ink and real mixed media. So the foraging part of it is very important. I think without that, I definitely can see I wouldn't do what I'm doing. Yeah, it also gives one a sense of place, because that's quite important to me. I think that whoever we are very, very connected to the place that we find ourselves, and you respond to where you are. And I think we don't realize it. A lot of people don't realize that their reactions, their responses are very much part of where they are, not just in the timeline of their life, but in the actual physical environment. So whether that's in that environment is nature, which I'm very lucky to say mine is, or whether it's in the middle of a built-up city, you respond to that. And I think one's art reflects that. And sometimes it's a very subconscious, subtle thing. Experiencing that place to me is very important with what I do. So using the actual physical foraged, whatever it might be, whether it's a feather off the beach or a protea leaf, I'll find it, draw it, work with it, and it will come out in my whatever work I'm doing at the time. Yeah, and I'm just sitting here looking around me. I've even used my mop-up cloths, so I'll show you one of them because I think they're absolutely beautiful, and I think you'll enjoy it. So here is a mop-up. It's a piece of paper which I've used to mop up ink with during one of my painting processes. It is. It's absolutely scrumptious, and there's another one there. So they look like tie-dyed pieces of cloth.
Yes.
And those will eventually make it into a sketchbook or a collage, or even if it's a tiny little piece, which is just the right color in the right place. So I don't throw anything away. As I say, I'm a real squirrel. I think most artists are.
Yes.
And yes. And because it's what feeds your soul, you and the details of what's around you is just extraordinary, and the plants for me, around me, are just absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
The fynbos is a very
So,
inspiring place to live.
It is, and even where I was doing quirky drawings for for my first colouring in book that I illustrated, I have got 5, I think. But particularly the first one, even though the drawings were quite quirky, they were all based in the flowers and the plants around me. Just made them a little bit quirkier, and I picked an old protea. What would you call it? A sort of a bit of a protea stalk, if you like, and if you draw it as it is, it's really quite interesting and very quirky. It's got all sorts of round bits and bumps, and if you draw it just with a line, you end up with quite a quirky drawing. So that's how it presented itself in those first colouring in books, and which I really enjoyed doing. And eventually ended up doing a book of mandalas, and that was used by Di Van Niekerk and Hazel Blomkamp as a base for the latest embroidery book that the pair of them have worked on. And that was really fun to do, because although I use a lot of stitching in my work generally, I'm not really, I wouldn't call myself an embroiderer.
Yes.
So it was really interesting to see how the pros do it, because they did.
And that must have been
such a fair.
That must have been a wonderful experience to see how something that you started, you then handed over to somebody else who's totally competent in their field, and they transformed it into something even more magical.
It was, and the interpretations, because you hand your drawing over and it can be interpreted in a million different ways. So it was a fascinating and very, very interesting process. And I think with everything one does in life, if you learn a lot. Yes. And if you take those, you can't take everything, but if you take the bits that interest you and you apply them to other parts of what you do, I think that's why I love doing the mixed media thing, is because I want to try everything. Angie's a bit like that too, and yes. You just, what if you use that on that? Eventually you end up with this really busy piece of work. You've got to pare it back a bit, but I really enjoy the experimenting part, and I think I don't stop experimenting.
Yes.
They say you should just sort of stick to what you know, but my brain's not built like that. Why? I'm always asking why. What if?
You prefer to stick to what you don't know and keep experimenting.
Exactly, something like that.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. So every work of art or artwork that I do it teaches me something. And I think when I feel like, oh well, I know everything, then I'll just stop. So there's no ways I'll ever know everything. So I just have to keep at it. Luckily, art's not something you retire from. You just you do what you do.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a lot of people work for a lifetime to be able to have the space to become an artist in their retirement. So it's quite a gift that you've had a lifetime of that exploration.
Yes, it has been a gift, but it's not been an easy path. And I think those that waited for their retirement are probably going to retire on a lot more than I will. So, yes. That side of it. But I think that you have to be careful if you're going to wait till you retire, because tomorrow never comes.
Yes.
You've got to do what you're drawn to when you're drawn to it.
Yes.
Because you know, art making is not just something that you well, maybe for some people it is, but I think generally speaking, it's not a magic wand. You don't pick up a pencil and now I can draw. It's like playing a musical instrument. You have to practice it. It's a practice. So that's why people talk about their art practice, because it is a practice. It's like music. You have to practice. And some people are, as I say, better or more, perhaps more gifted than others. But yeah, as with music, you must practice.
What do you enjoy the most about art making?
Gosh, I don't know. Everything. That's a really difficult question, because there's so many facets to art making. It's not just painting on a canvas or drawing or whatever. It's a very holistic thing. So, as I said earlier, for me, my practice starts with walking and with what I see around me. And it was really, really brought home to me very strongly as to how important that bit is at the beginning of lockdown. So in a way, that was a gift to me, to just say, hey, wake up, walk more. So I really enjoy going out and making really, really quick sketches of a little spot. I go and sit on a rock, and where I am, it is quite rocky, and the rock shapes are really interesting.
Yes.
So I'll go on a rock and I'll draw a landscape that's in front of me. Just really quick 5-minute scratchy sketches,
Yes.
And I'll bring them back, and I'll in my studio I might interpret them as a painting, or never use them as matter. It's just part of the process. And then I'll perhaps have taken some plant samples, and I'll bring them back and I'll print with them, and then maybe use those prints later in a collage. And so it's everything is connected. There's no disconnect. It's just what you do with what you've got, really. So what everything.
So you prefer to kind of work with a generative process where you sit with the start of something, and then you allow it almost to tell you what it wants to become, as opposed to, because I know some artists want to draw something finished and then almost retrofit. Okay, now what do I need to do to make this happen?
I don't work like that at all.
Okay.
It's a very organic, fluid thing.
Yes.
That the way that I work, it's quite scary, actually, in a way.
Yes.
And perhaps when I stop being scared by it, I'll stop. I never quite know. I'll have an idea of something, perhaps, and all my work starts with some sort of a collage.
Okay.
In a way, and that collage might end up being completely covered up. In a way, it's a way to get rid of that big blank space that's in front of you. Is to you because a big white canvas, or although I don't work that much on canvases, but a big white piece of paper is quite a scary thing. You might mess it up, especially if it's a good piece of paper.
Yes.
So a good way to start for me is to start with a collage, And every bit of collage or paper that I'm using within that is something that I'll have made in another part of my process. So I tend not to use torn out magazine bits and things like that. They're all the paste, even if it's the lappy that I use to clean up my ink, because that's also something that's come from within that process.
Yes.
And so then I'll piece the whole thing together and perhaps paint on that, or paint and stitch, or it's a very organic thing. And as you say, the piece tells me what it wants, and sometimes it doesn't, which is really annoying.
What do you do when that happens? Do you put it aside until it starts talking to you again, or do you kind of push through with it until it's complete?
If you push too hard, you end up with something that is just a big fight. And there are certainly works that you fight with. Particularly halfway through, I think a lot of artists will find that there's this point that you reach where you kind of think, okay, now what? This is so ugly. I can't. What will I do with it? And you do have to push past that bit. But sometimes I'll just put it on a board in my studio and look at it. Or other times I might think, oh, this is so ugly, I can't bear it, and put it away completely. And then find it when I'm looking for something else, and then think, oh, that bit's interesting.
Yes.
And I think that's the nice thing about working with paper, is that if I hate everything else except a minute centimeter square in one corner, I can actually tear that out.
Okay.
And so, I might tear a piece of work up and make it part of something else.
Okay.
So it's a very organic process.
And is paper your favorite medium to work in?
At the moment.
Okay.
Yes, I have been working with paper for quite a long time, and I think because of the tearing, stitching thing that I can do with it, it's working for me. It's not to say that I, might not take, say, a half-finished collage stitched piece and put it onto canvas and then carry on painting on it. I might do that. But most of my work at the moment is just paper, which it's also a lot, much easier to stitch on than, say, a canvas. And the layers are easier for me to do. So the paper I work with is actually really thin. I work with rice paper and tissue paper quite a lot. And then I stabilize it and do the stitching onto that. So it's like a paper quilt. So it's not that much different from fabric. But because I can work in such thin layers and paint with inks and things, it's working for me at the moment, but it might change.
That's wonderful. Oh, Monique, I could listen to your story all day, but I do notice that we are beginning to run out of time. If anybody else who's watching would like to see your work and find it, where can they find you online?
So I have a website, which is www.Monique Day-Wilde, which is wild with an E on the end. And that's co.za. And I'm also on Instagram at Wild at Art. And I have a Facebook page. So if you just go onto Facebook and look for Monique Day-Wilde or Monique Day-Wilde at Art, you'll find me there as well. But if you want to contact me through my website, it's probably the best bet.
Okay, that's awesome. That was such an inspiring story. I feel very, very privileged to have spoken to you today. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thanks for the opportunity, Melanie. Thank you very much.
It's a huge pleasure.